Good afternoons, and thank you for attending this talk today. We're going to talk a little bit about securing microservices. My glasses actually is causing so much glare. We'll talk a little bit about securing microservices. And I'm with Kong, and my name again is Andrew. And again, thank you for attending this talk. So to get us started, we have a couple of big topics that we're going to try and cover pretty quickly. So I'll jump straight in. Most organizations go through this effort of decomposing, say, the monolith and breaking it down into multiple services. Now, one thing to take into consideration as they do this is that the monolith never goes away, right? It still exists on your network, and which means that the legacy methods that we use to protect that monolith continue to exist. And so you now have your monolith coexisting with your existing microservices platforms. So we then run into this problem where, and this typically is where InfoSec begins to realize that there is an incongruence between how they were securing the monolith versus how they need to secure their microservice, right? And a lot of that has to do with the inherent nature of how microservices communicate, right? So when we think about the monolith, say, for example, it's an e-commerce application, right? That e-commerce application is typically going to have multiple components that are communicating within a single process, right? And the monolith itself exposes itself to the outside world via one or two interfaces, meaning that if it is accessible through HTTP or HTTPS, that is how it appears on the network, right? And the internal communications between the services or between the different components, say the invoice component, talking to the orders component, that is happening as an in-process function. Now, as we break that monolith down, and now we've got these microservices on the network, we run into two things, right? The first is that the communications that were typically in-process, internal, are now happening over the network, right? That is problem number one. And this is when the InfoSec people start really getting the heebie-jeebies. The next as well is that the microservice itself now is actually an object. It is an entity that sits on the network. So as an InfoSec person, the two things that occur to you is that your attack surface for this application just increased almost exponentially, right? Your attack surface, or the number of entry points into your application now, increased and are as many as the microservices that you have on your network, right? And this really is the crux of the problem, right? Is that we now have multiple entry points into our application, and our microservices now are communicating over the network, which means that if we have any nefarious actors on the network, that is communication that could be easily exploited, right? So a lot of InfoSec organizations have to deal with this concern, and typically they turn to publications such as those listed on the screen, right? This is something I pulled out of a book that I was reading. And this is just a list of government entities across the world, including US, many US entities here that have published publications around zero trust, right? So as you can see, it's a ton of entities, right? But what we want to do is, if you glean or if you peruse a lot of this through this documentation, there are three takeaways that we can get from this documentation that can begin to guide how we need to secure our microservices, right? And by the way, when I talk about microservices, that extends to the APIs as well, right? Because our APIs really is just how our microservice gets exposed onto the network, right? So the two working assumptions, I've broken down these three takeaways into two working assumptions and one overarching goal. And the two working assumptions are, we assume the network to be hostile at all times, right? And the second one is that we assume that the adversary is on the network at every time, right? And this may seem like common sense, but typically this is not what you find in a lot of organizations that were typically defending monoliths, right, or protecting against monoliths, because typically you had a firewall and some bespoke entity that sat at the edge of your perimeter, and that firewall allowed in access to your applications. And once you pass that firewall and you access the monolith, the idea is that if you're talking to the monolith, you must be an okay dude, right? But the working assumptions from the zero trust publications are these two. We must assume the network is hostile at all times and assume that the adversary is on the network at all times. And typically, when we talk about the adversaries on the network at all times, I like to think of this term that you hear thrown about, advanced persistent threats, which is the idea that the attacker could be on the network for weeks, months, years, just simply observing, capturing, and figuring out, okay, do I have enough information now to compromise an account that will then allow me to move laterally within the organization? Now, the next assumption from the publications revolves around identity, and this is how we begin to neuter some of this, the two previous assumptions. And it's two things. One is identity, and that is that we want to authenticate and authorize always, right? And we may think that this is happening, but this is typically not happening in our communications internally in our networks today, right? Typically it's, if you have a firewall and it is protecting, say it's saying entity A can talk to entity B, that is typically based on an IP address. It is not really on the actual identity of the application, right? So what the Zero Trust publication is actually saying is that we want to move up the stack, right? So we want to move from the network layer and move up the stack and begin to say that the only way entity A talks to entity B is if entity A is able to prove to entity B that it really is entity A by presenting some type of identity, right? The next thing is we move security controls closer to the application. And again, this is the notion of, instead of this bespoke firewall that sits at the edge, right? The idea is that we begin to move those type of security controls to the application, as close to the application as possible, right? That is the idea of this. Now, why are we doing this? The idea here is we assume that the adversary is on the network, and therefore our goal is to make sure that if the adversary is not able to compromise our workloads, or if they did, then the limit or the blast radius of what they can do is minimalized, right? So the idea is that we make it as extremely difficult for the adversary, who we assume is on the network, to compromise our workloads. And if they do, we make it such that they cannot laterally move across our network. Okay, so let's talk about what the identities afford us. And this is the big changer. So the identities, again, once we begin to assign them to our applications, is that the first thing is that they're ephemeral, right? And ephemeral means that some mechanism exists that is going to assign an identity to an application, and that identity can change every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every 45 minutes. Now, if you think about this from the perspective of the adversary that is on the network, then what we're telling that adversary is, if you're going to compromise that credential will change in 15 minutes, and you have to do that again. And eventually, our security apparatus should trigger or catch what he is doing. And then obviously, these identities then allow us to authenticate between services, which means service A can now authenticate itself to service B. We're able to do authorization of services, which means that service B or service A is able to, or service B is able to verify what service A can or cannot do through authorization. We have encryption and confidentiality, which means that when service A is communicating with service B, that is encrypted, which means if our adversary is on the network, even if they were to snoop or attempt to snoop that traffic, they're not able to see or detect what is on the network. So very quickly, we're going to go through how Kong can help and how Kong is helping organizations deal with these challenges today. So this is a layered approach, right? It's a defense and depth strategy. And the idea here is two-pronged, right? Through Kong's API gateway, where we're able to apply coarse-grained policies at the edge, right? So imagine that the traffic is flowing north-south into our services and then east-west across our microservices. So at the north, we've got our API gateway. In this particular case, it's API gateway, and that is what, say, will perhaps, is going to be synced up or connected to your identity provider of choice, and then authentication happens in the north, and then down to the service layer, we've got the service mesh, Kong mesh in this particular case, that is responsible for assigning the ephemeral identities, and from the ephemeral identities, then we're able to authenticate and encrypt and so on and so forth, right? And just to dive a little bit deeper, security at the edge, we see that The API gateway is able to afford us QoS at the edge, right? So we can begin to say we want to rate limit, for example, or throttle traffic or requests as they come through. Analytics, we're able to do authentication at the edge. We can verify who the user is as they come through to access our APIs and services. And eventually, we want to be able to pass that information down to our services. And our service needs to make sure that as it receives that token that says Jim wants to access this particular API, that it really is Jim. And how does that happen? That happens because the API gateway is able to sign that request using, say, a JSON Web Token and send it down to the microservices, which are then able to verify that because they both trust the issue of the identities. And then we have now at the mesh layer, we've got our service mesh, in this particular case, Kong Mesh. And Kong Mesh is able to provide us the following abilities. We have microperimeters, right? Or basically turning every microservice into a policy enforcement point. And that is something that we're able to begin to do with the service mesh. Again, going back to the Zero Trust publications and what they're asking us to do, which is that we want to bring policy as close to the workload as possible, right? Service mesh and Kong mesh in this particular case allows us to do that. The policy enforcement point, every microservice now turns into a policy enforcement point, and we're not relying on a, say, firewall at the edge to do this, right? We have ephemeral identities to services. So Kong mesh is responsible for dynamically issuing identities to services that are time-bound. That identity could expire in 15, 20, 30 minutes, which then forces the adversary to try to figure out how to compromise another credential in that time frame and laterally move if they can. We're also able to do now service-to-service, service-level authorization. This is another really important key thing, because we have to assume at some point that our services will get compromised. The question is, if they get compromised, how much damage can the attacker do, right? And through authorization policies, we're able to begin to limit that, because if service A was compromised and it is talking to service B and it is trying to do more than what it is allowed to do with service B, authorization policies are denied, and because each microservice is a policy enforcement point, it is able to detect that service A is doing what it is not allowed to do, right? And then finally, this microservices are able to act on the request. Again, remember, Jim or John, I forget, was trying to access a resource inside our cluster, right? Or inside our services. And the API gateway was able to sign that in such a way that when the services or the end API receives it, it is able to verify, and it knows that this was indeed signed by an entity that I signed, in this particular case, our API gateway. So, in closing, right, depth in strategy, defense in depth, right? We have our API gateway that it becomes our entry point into our environment, right? And this is how our customers or clients engage with us. We're able to apply fine-grained or coarse-grained policies, I should say, at the edge of our API gateway. Our API gateway is also responsible for passing along that user context to the microservices, so the microservices know who they're communicating with. And upon receipt of that, the service mesh is responsible for turning every service into a policy enforcement point, and it is able to verify what it receives from the API gateway. Additionally, every service is able to authenticate each other, and so on and so forth, stuff that we've mentioned. Now, typically, a lot of our customers come to us with another question. How do we manage this at scale? Right? A lot of our customers are running on-prem. A lot of our customers are running in the cloud. A lot of our customers are running at the edge. And the question to us is, how do we manage these policies at scale? Right? We want to be able to perhaps centrally create policy and be able to push that policy. We might have uniform policy that applies to all environments. How do we apply this at scale? Right? Or our customers may come to us and ask us, we want to be able to deploy these runtimes, these API gateways, this service mesh. We want to deploy this service mesh infrastructure layer in a new environment that was just stood up. How can we quickly and efficiently do that, right? And that is our Connect SaaS management plane. And through this management plane, our customers are therefore able to connect to whatever environment they so choose, and through that, they're able to either deploy the runtimes if that is what they intend to do, or create policy if that is what they intend to do, push policy down to this individual runtimes, visibility into what policies have been activated, analytics about the APIs that are being accessed, and so on and so forth. So that is a very, very quick. I covered a lot of ground there, very, very many complex topics, which this is an area, by the way, that really, really excites me. And I jumped into this very, very quickly, thinking that I was going to overrun my 20 minutes. But apparently, I still have 4 minutes, which is cheers to me. But thank you very, very much. I will, pass it on over to you.